Today, we're diving into Slavoj Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology, a dense but rewarding work that combines psychoanalysis, philosophy, and cultural critique. If you're familiar with philosophy in general but new to Žižek, this is the perfect place to start understanding his thought. It's his first major work, and it lays out many of the foundational ideas that he would develop throughout his career. To understand Žižek, we'll need to explore his use of Lacanian psychoanalysis, his critique of ideology, and his reinterpretation of Hegel. Let's break this down step by step. To begin, we need to address what Žižek means by ideology. For Žižek, ideology is not just a set of beliefs or propaganda. It's the invisible framework through which we perceive reality itself. He draws from Marx's notion of ideology as a form of false consciousness, but Žižek modernizes it by incorporating Lacan's psychoanalytic theory. In traditional Marxist terms, ideology obscures the truth of exploitation. For Žižek, ideology doesn't just distort reality, it actively constitutes it. It's the lens through which we interpret the world, and we are often unaware that we are operating within it. To understand this, we have to bring in Lacan, particularly his ideas about the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. The real, for Lacan, is what resists symbolization. It's the ungraspable kernel of existence that can't be fully integrated into our systems of meaning. The symbolic is the domain of language, law, and societal structures. The big other that organizes our reality. The imaginary, on the other hand, is the realm of images and illusions, where we construct identities and fantasies. Žižek takes these Lacanian concepts and applies them to ideology, arguing that ideology operates in the space between the symbolic and the imaginary. It gives us a framework to understand the world, but it also masks the real, the traumatic kernel that ideology can't fully contain. Žižek's unique contribution is his concept of the sublime object of ideology. The sublime object is something that appears within ideology as both ordinary and extraordinary, as something that holds the system together, but also points to its fundamental inconsistency. Think of it like a magic trick. The sublime object is the thing that distracts you, keeping you focused on the illusion, rather than the mechanics of the trick itself. In this sense, ideology functions not by convincing us that its narrative is true, but by organizing our desires and fantasies around these sublime objects. To make this more concrete, let's consider a modern example. Money. Money is just paper or numbers on a screen, but within our ideological framework, it becomes imbued with a near-magical quality. It organizes our social interactions, structures power relationships, and fuels our desires. Yet if we step outside this framework and ask, what is money really? We confront its emptiness. It's nothing but a socially constructed symbol. Money, in this sense, is a sublime object. It holds the system together precisely because it masks the void, the lack of intrinsic meaning at its core. Žižek also uses Lacan's notion of the objet petit a to elaborate on the sublime object. The objet petit a is the object cause of desire. It's what we are always pursuing but can never fully attain. In ideology, the sublime object functions in a similar way. It promises fulfillment. It organizes our fantasies, but it always remains just out of reach. This is why we cling to ideology even when it seems to fail us. It provides a structure for our desires, and without it, we risk confronting the void of the real. Žižek critiques the traditional Marxist view of ideology by emphasizing enjoyment, or what Lacan calls jouissance. For Marx, ideology serves the ruling class by perpetuating false consciousness. Žižek agrees but goes further, arguing that ideology works not just because it deceives us, but because it offers us a form of enjoyment. Think about how nationalism functions. It's not just about believing in a nation's superiority. It's about the shared rituals, symbols, and fantasies that create a sense of belonging and purpose. This enjoyment, or jouissance, is what makes ideology so resistant to critique. Even when we recognize its contradictions, we often continue to participate in it because it provides us with pleasure. One of Žižek's most provocative claims is that ideology persists even in so-called post-ideological societies. In the modern world, we often think we've moved beyond ideology, that we're too rational or skeptical to be manipulated by it. Žižek calls this belief cynical ideology. In cynical ideology, we are fully aware that the system is flawed or unjust, but we act as if it isn't. This is best captured in the phrase, "I know very well, but still." For example, many people are fully aware that consumerism is unsustainable, yet they continue to participate in it because it's easier than confronting the real, the traumatic kernel of truth that lies outside ideology. Žižek's reading of Hegel is crucial to his argument. Hegel's dialectical method, often misunderstood as a simplistic process of thesis-antithesis-synthesis, is much more complex. For Hegel, contradictions are not problems to be resolved, but the very motor of progress. Truth emerges not by overcoming contradictions, but by dwelling within them, by allowing them to unfold and reveal their deeper logic. Žižek applies this to ideology, arguing that the contradictions within ideology are not signs of its failure, but of its functioning. Ideology works precisely because it contains its own critique. Think of how late-night comedians mock capitalism while still thriving within it. This internal critique allows us to maintain our distance while continuing to participate. Žižek's method is deeply Hegelian in that it seeks to reveal the gaps and inconsistencies within ideology, not to destroy it outright, but to show how it operates. He often uses humor and pop culture to illustrate his points, which makes his work both accessible and deeply unsettling. For example, he might analyze a Hollywood blockbuster to show how its narrative structure reinforces ideological fantasies. In the Sublime Object of Ideology, Žižek uses Hitchcock's films as a case study, arguing that their suspense and misdirection mirror the workings of ideology itself. Ultimately, Žižek challenges us to confront the real, the traumatic truth that lies beyond ideology. This is not an easy task, and Žižek acknowledges that ideology provides a kind of comfort, a way to make sense of the world. But he insists that true freedom requires us to traverse the fantasy, to confront the gaps and contradictions within our ideological framework, and to see how they shape our desires and actions. Let's delve deeper into how Žižek builds on these ideas and expands their implications, particularly in terms of subjectivity and power structures. One of the key elements of the Sublime Object of Ideology is its exploration of how ideology not only structures our understanding of the world, but also defines how we perceive ourselves as subjects. Žižek draws heavily from Lacanian psychoanalysis to argue that the subject itself is an effect of the symbolic order, the domain of language and societal norms that organizes our reality. This means that our very sense of self, our identity, is inseparable from the ideological framework we inhabit. For Lacan, the subject is barred, meaning that it is split, incomplete, and defined by a fundamental lack. This lack arises because our desires can never be fully satisfied. The things we pursue always fall short of the fulfillment we imagine they will bring. Žižek takes this insight and applies it to ideology, arguing that ideology provides a way of managing this lack. It doesn't fill the void at the heart of the subject, but it gives us a framework within which to organize our desires and make sense of the gap. This is why ideology is so deeply rooted in human experience. It addresses our existential condition, the very structure of our being. Let's illustrate this with an example. Consider the American dream, a quintessential ideological construct. It tells us that anyone, through hard work and determination, can achieve success and prosperity. This narrative provides a sense of purpose and direction, a way to frame our struggles and aspirations. But as many critics have pointed out, the American dream is often at odds with material reality. It obscures systemic inequalities and the barriers that prevent many people from achieving its promises. Yet, even when we recognize these contradictions, the dream persists as a powerful force in shaping our desires and actions. Why? Because it functions as a fantasy that organizes our relationship to the lack within us. It gives us something to strive for, even if it is ultimately unattainable. Žižek's analysis of fantasy is crucial here. In Lacanian terms, fantasy is not merely an escape from reality. It's the frame through which we engage with reality. It structures how we relate to the world and to others, mediating our desires and anxieties. Ideology operates through fantasy, providing a narrative or image that helps us navigate the gaps and inconsistencies in our experience. This is why Žižek often emphasizes the enjoyment or jouissance that ideology offers. Even when an ideological system fails to deliver on its promises, we cling to it because it provides a way of organizing our desires and confronting the lack at the heart of our subjectivity. Now let's consider how this plays out in political ideology. Žižek argues that ideology doesn't just tell us what to believe, it shapes how we desire. Take nationalism, for example. Nationalist ideology doesn't just provide a set of beliefs about one's country. It creates a sense of belonging, pride, and even love. These emotions are tied to rituals, symbols, and myths that reinforce the ideological framework. But nationalism also relies on an enemy, a figure that embodies the threat to the nation's identity and unity. This is what Žižek calls the obscene underside of ideology. The way it constructs its fantasies of unity and purity by projecting its contradictions onto an external scapegoat. The enemy becomes a way of displacing the internal conflicts and inconsistencies of the national community onto an external figure, allowing the ideology to maintain its coherence. Žižek connects this to Lacan's concept of the objet petit a, the object cause of desire. In nationalist ideology, the enemy functions as an objet petit a figure that both fascinates and repels, organizing the community's desires and anxieties. This dynamic is not limited to nationalism. It operates in all ideological systems, from religion to consumerism. By analyzing these dynamics, Žižek reveals how ideology is not just about ideas or beliefs, but about the structures of desire and enjoyment that bind us to it. Žižek also challenges the notion that we can ever fully escape ideology. He critiques the idea of a pure or neutral standpoint from which we can critique ideological systems. For Žižek, there is no outside of ideology. Our very subjectivity is constituted within it. This doesn't mean that critique is impossible, but it requires a different approach. Instead of trying to step outside ideology, we need to confront its internal contradictions, its gaps and inconsistencies. This is what Žižek means by traversing the fantasy. It's not about rejecting ideology altogether, but about exposing its functioning and rethinking our relationship to it. To bring in Hegel again, Žižek's method is profoundly dialectical. For Hegel, contradictions are not obstacles to be resolved, but the driving force of development. Žižek applies this to ideology, showing how its contradictions reveal its underlying mechanisms. By engaging with these contradictions, we can begin to see how ideology shapes our desires and perceptions, and how it organizes our relationship to the real, the ungraspable kernel of existence that resists symbolization. This leads us to one of the most challenging and provocative aspects of Žižek's thought, the idea that confronting the real is both necessary and traumatic. The real is not some ultimate truth or essence that lies beyond ideology. It's the impossibility of fully symbolizing reality, the gap that remains no matter how comprehensive our frameworks become. For Žižek, this gap is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be acknowledged. It's what makes us human, what drives our creativity and our struggles. Ideology, fantasy, and desire are all ways of managing this gap, but they can never eliminate it. Žižek's analysis has profound implications for how we understand politics, culture, and subjectivity. It challenges us to think beyond simplistic notions of truth and falsehood, to recognize the complex interplay of desire, enjoyment, and contradiction that shapes our world. By bringing together Lacanian psychoanalysis, Hegelian dialectics, and Marxist critique, Žižek offers a powerful framework for understanding not just ideology, but the very structure of human experience. And in doing so, he invites us to confront the most fundamental questions about who we are, what we desire, and how we relate to the world around us. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology. I hope this exploration has provided some clarity on his complex ideas and how they intertwine with Lacan, Hegel, and Marx. If you found this video thought-provoking or challenging, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspectives. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.